I told you this would happen!
We had no other choice.
Look at the map now!
Yes, sir. We can adjust.
We must advance now! The enemy's weak!
No, we need more resources first.
Gentlemen, the map shows our best chance!
September 1944. The Wolf's Lair, East Prussia. A courier delivers the daily situation report to the operations room. General Jodl reads it twice, then places it carefully on the table without speaking. The 5th Panzer Army, Germany's last strategic reserve in the West, has ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Not destroyed in a single climactic battle. Disintegrated across 3 days of continuous engagement with Patton's 3rd Army near Aracourt. 62 tanks lost in the first 18 hours. Command structure collapsed. Divisions scattered. This wasn't a setback. This was the end of Germany's ability to conduct mobile defense in Western Europe. And everyone in that room understood what it meant. There would be no more counteroffensives, no more strategic reserves, no more armies held back for the decisive moment. Germany had just used its last operational card, and Patton had destroyed it before it could even deploy properly.
Gentlemen, we advance on the flank at dawn. Yes, sir. Reinforcements are ready. And the supply lines? Secured.
The 5th Panzer Army represented the culmination of months of desperate effort by German High Command to create one final mobile reserve capable of conducting offensive operations in the West. Throughout the summer of 1944, as the situation in France deteriorated, OKW had been quietly pulling panzer divisions from other fronts, reconstituting damaged formations, and hoarding the limited production of new tanks. The goal was assembling a force powerful enough to launch a counteroffensive that might stabilize the Western Front. By early September, 5th Panzer Army comprised approximately 150 operational tanks, including the newest Panther and Tiger variants, supported by infantry divisions and artillery. By the degraded standards of late 1944, this represented a substantial force.
Gentlemen, the enemy advances! We must attack now!
But sir, our reserves are depleted.
No excuses! We hold the line!
More importantly, it represented virtually everything Germany could spare for the Western theater. The Eastern Front was consuming divisions as fast as they could be deployed. Italy was a secondary priority. This was the reserve. There was nothing behind it. The operational plan called for 5th Panzer Army to attack 3rd Army's extended supply lines near Nancy, cutting American communications and forcing a general withdrawal. German planners believed that Patton's rapid advance had created vulnerabilities that a concentrated armored assault could exploit. If successful, the counteroffensive might buy time for constructing defensive positions along the German frontier.
Gentlemen, the time for hesitation is over! We strike now with full force! Victory is within reach!
At minimum, it would demonstrate that Germany retained offensive capability and could impose costs on Allied advances. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding 5th Panzer Army, understood the strategic significance of his force. This wasn't just another tactical operation. This was Germany's last chance to regain initiative in the West through offensive action. His briefings to subordinate commanders emphasized that failure wasn't just unacceptable, it was impossible to recover from. There would be no second attempt, no additional reserves to commit if this operation failed. Success was essential because there were no alternatives. The army began moving toward its assembly areas in mid-September. The movement was conducted with extraordinary security measures. Radio silence was strictly enforced. Units traveled primarily at night to avoid Allied air reconnaissance. Assembly areas were dispersed and camouflaged. German intelligence believed they had achieved tactical surprise. Patton's forces appeared focused on their own advance toward the Saar region, not on defensive preparations against counterattack. But achieving surprise and exploiting it were different challenges. 5th Panzer Army was moving through territory that Allied air forces dominated completely. Any concentration of forces would be visible and vulnerable. The assembly process was taking longer than planned, because units had to disperse whenever aircraft appeared overhead. What should have taken 3 days was stretching into a week. The window for achieving surprise was closing even before the attack began. German commanders at Army Group level were already expressing concerns about the operation's viability. Reports from the front indicated that American defensive positions were stronger than intelligence had assessed. 3rd Army's supply situation, which German planners believed was stretched to breaking point, appeared more robust than expected. Some commanders privately questioned whether 5th Panzer Army was strong enough to achieve its objectives, even under favorable conditions. But the operation proceeded because there was no alternative strategy available. The attack began on September 19th near Aracourt, a small town that became the focal point for Germany's last attempt at offensive operations in the West. Initial reports reaching OKW were cautiously optimistic. Panzer units had achieved some penetration of American forward positions. Surprise appeared partially achieved. Resistance was present, but not overwhelming. The first hours suggested the operation might accomplish at least some of its objectives. By midday, the reports changed character dramatically. American forces were responding with unexpected speed and coordination. Tank destroyer battalions were engaging German armor at extreme ranges with devastating accuracy. Artillery fire was precisely directed, suggesting good observation and communication. Most critically, Allied air power was arriving in overwhelming strength, despite weather conditions that German meteorologists had predicted would limit air operations. The tactical situation deteriorated rapidly throughout the afternoon. German panzer companies that had advanced confidently in the morning were pinned down or destroyed by early evening. American Sherman tanks, operating in larger numbers than German intelligence had assessed, were exploiting gaps in German formations. The attack wasn't just stalling. It was being systematically dismantled by an opponent who appeared to have anticipated the assault and prepared specifically to counter it. 5th Panzer Army's command structure began experiencing the communication breakdowns that preceded organizational collapse. Division commanders couldn't contact all their subordinate units. Corps headquarters was receiving contradictory reports about which positions were held and which had been abandoned. Radio traffic increased dramatically as units requested clarification, support, or permission to withdraw. The communication network was overloading at exactly the moment when coordination was most essential. By nightfall of September 19th, the situation reports reaching OKW painted a devastating picture. 5th Panzer Army had lost approximately one-third of its operational tanks in a single day. Several battalion-sized formations were cut off and surrounded. The planned exploitation phase of the operation couldn't proceed because the breakthrough phase had failed. Von Manteuffel was reporting that continuing the offensive would likely result in complete destruction of his remaining forces. He was requesting permission to transition to defensive operations. The shock at OKW was palpable, according to accounts from officers present at evening briefings. This was supposed to be Germany's last strategic reserve demonstrating its capability. Instead, it had been roughly handled in a single day by forces it was meant to overwhelm. The carefully hoarded tanks, the meticulously assembled divisions, the months of preparation had achieved nothing except exposing Germany's remaining armored strength to destruction. Jodel's assessment, delivered to Hitler that evening, was grimly realistic. The counteroffensive had failed. 5th Panzer Army had suffered losses it couldn't sustain if the operation continued. The only question was whether to authorize immediate withdrawal to preserve remaining strength or continue attacking in hope of achieving something that might justify the losses already incurred. The strategic reserve was burning away in a single day, and Germany had nothing to replace it with. September 20th and 21st witnessed the systematic destruction of 5th Panzer Army as an effective fighting force. The American response wasn't just defensive. 3rd Army launched immediate counterattacks that exploited every German weakness. Tank units that had been carefully assembled over months were being destroyed in hours. The operation had transitioned from failed offensive to desperate defensive action to outright collapse. The reports reaching OKW during these days documented organizational death in real time. Division commanders reported losing contact with half their units. Tank strengths that had been 150 at the operation's start were now assessed at fewer than 40 operational vehicles. Infantry divisions supporting the panzer assault were scattered and unable to maintain coherent defensive lines. The Army's logistical system was breaking down as supply convoys were destroyed or forced to flee before reaching forward units. What made the collapse particularly devastating was its speed. Military organizations typically degrade gradually under sustained pressure. 5th Panzer Army was disintegrating in days. The tempo of American operations, the precision of their responses, the overwhelming application of firepower all created conditions where German units couldn't stabilize positions or conduct organized withdrawals. Units would attempt to establish defensive positions and find American forces already behind them. Withdrawal routes would be cut before retreating units could use them. German high command watched helplessly as their last reserve evaporated. There were no additional forces to commit, no cavalry arriving to save the situation. The Eastern Front couldn't spare units. Other sectors in the West had no reserves to transfer. 5th Panzer Army was dying, and Germany's strategic situation was dying with it. The operational flexibility that mobile reserves provided, the ability to respond to threats and exploit opportunities, was being permanently removed from Germany's strategic options. Von Manteuffel's final report from this period documented the magnitude of disaster. 5th Panzer Army had effectively ceased to exist as an operational formation. Scattered units remained in various stages of retreat or encirclement, but the army as an organized force capable of conducting coordinated operations was gone. Total tank losses exceeded 100 vehicles. Several thousand soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured. The survivors were streaming east in disorder, no longer under effective command control. The psychological impact on German high command was profound. This wasn't just another tactical defeat to be absorbed and adjusted to. This was the moment when Germany's strategic position became irretrievable through military means alone. Without mobile reserves, without offensive capability, Germany could only defend fixed positions and watch those positions be systematically reduced. The war in the West had fundamentally changed, and everyone at OKW understood that the change was permanent and irreversible. The strategic implications of 5th Panzer Army's destruction were immediately apparent to German planners, even if Hitler initially refused to fully acknowledge them. Germany's entire defensive strategy for the West had assumed the existence of mobile reserves that could counterattack Allied penetrations, threaten their flanks, and force caution in their advances. Without those reserves, the entire strategic framework collapsed. OKW staff officers began preparing assessments of Germany's situation in the West following the loss of 5th Panzer Army. These assessments made grim reading. Allied forces could now advance with confidence that no significant counteroffensive capability existed to threaten their operations. German forces could defend specific positions, but couldn't prevent eventual Allied breakthrough, because they lacked means to respond to breakthroughs once they occurred. The defensive line would inevitably be rolled up sector by sector with nothing available to restore it. The industrial and replacement situation made reconstituting 5th Panzer Army impossible within any militarily relevant time frame. Tank production was declining under Allied bombing. Trained crews were irreplaceable at current loss rates. The industrial capacity and training infrastructure required to build a new Panzer Army no longer existed. What had been destroyed at Ericourt couldn't be rebuilt. The loss was permanent. Several senior commanders privately expressed opinions that the war in the West was now militarily unwinnable. With no mobile reserves and no prospect of creating new ones, Germany could only delay inevitable defeat. The question was no longer whether Allied forces would reach Germany's borders, but when, and how much additional destruction would occur before the inevitable conclusion. These assessments were not defeatism, but realistic evaluation of military capabilities and strategic possibilities. Hitler's reaction to these assessments was to reject them and demand new offensives be planned, using forces that existed primarily on paper. He insisted that will and determination could compensate for material deficiencies. He blamed commanders for lack of aggressive spirit, rather than acknowledging that Germany simply lacked military means to conduct offensive operations. The gap between Hitler's demands and Germany's actual capabilities was growing into an unbridgeable chasm. The Ardennes offensive, planned in autumn 1944, would represent one final attempt to demonstrate offensive capability in the West. But even as it was being planned, officers at OKW understood it would consume remaining resources without achieving strategic objectives. The forces being assembled for the Ardennes would come from desperate scraping of every available unit, not from systematic buildup of proper strategic reserves. It would be Germany's last offensive, not because it succeeded, but because nothing would remain after it failed. The destruction of 5th Panzer Army at Ericourt marked the point where Germany's strategic situation transitioned from difficult to hopeless. Before September 1944, Germany could still theoretically stabilize the Western Front, given favorable circumstances. After September 1944, no plausible circumstances existed under which Germany could prevent eventual Allied victory. The loss of the last strategic reserve meant loss of strategic flexibility, and without flexibility, Germany could only react to Allied initiatives rather than imposing its own operational vision. The longer-term consequences of 5th Panzer Army's destruction extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation in September 1944. Germany had lost more than tanks and soldiers at Ericourt. It had lost the last possibility of conducting the kind of mobile defense that might have prolonged the war substantially. The transition from active defense with counteroffensive capability to purely passive defense meant the pace of Germany's defeat would accelerate. OKW's strategic planning after September became increasingly disconnected from military reality. Plans were developed for operations that required forces Germany didn't possess. Defensive lines were designated on maps that couldn't be adequately manned. Counterattacks were ordered using divisions that existed as administrative shells rather than combat-capable formations. The gap between planning and capability revealed how completely 5th Panzer Army's loss had undermined Germany's strategic position. The psychological impact on German military leadership was corrosive. Officers who had spent careers believing in German tactical and operational superiority were confronting reality that Germany could no longer conduct the kind of warfare it had pioneered. The mobile operations, the armored exploitation, the aggressive counterattacks that had defined German military doctrine were no longer possible. Germany was reduced to static defense, exactly the kind of warfare it had always viewed as operationally bankrupt. Allied commanders recognized immediately that something fundamental had changed in German capabilities after Ericourt. Third Army's intelligence assessments noted the absence of significant armored reserves in subsequent operations. Planning assumptions shifted from anticipating German counteroffensives to expecting only local defensive reactions. The operational environment had changed because Germany no longer possessed the forces necessary to threaten Allied advances. This recognition accelerated Allied operational tempo and increased the risks commanders were willing to accept. The industrial dimension was equally devastating. The tanks destroyed at Ericourt represented a significant fraction of Germany's total armored strength in the West. Replacing them was impossible given production rates and allocation priorities. The Tiger and Panther tanks lost in September couldn't be replaced in 1944. Germany's armored strength would continue declining throughout the remaining months of the war, ensuring that even if forces for new offensives could be assembled, they would be weaker than what had been destroyed at Ericourt. For historians examining Germany's defeat, the destruction of 5th Panzer Army represents one of the decisive moments when Germany's military situation became irretrievable. Other defeats were larger in scale. Other battles involved more forces. But few single engagements so completely removed Germany's capacity to influence the war's trajectory through military operations. After Ericourt, Germany could still fight, could still defend, could still inflict casualties. But it couldn't win, couldn't stabilize the front, couldn't force the kind of operational stalemate that might have created political opportunities for negotiated settlement. What the German High Command said when Patton destroyed their last army in reserve was, ultimately, very little that could be said publicly. The official communications emphasized determined resistance and confident defense. But the private assessments, the internal reports, the conversations among senior officers, all reflected the same devastating realization. Germany had committed its last operational reserve to an offensive that failed catastrophically. There were no more reserves. No more mobile armies, no more strategic flexibility. The war in the West had been lost at Ericourt, even though fighting would continue for 8 more months. Everyone at OKW understood this, even if Hitler refused to acknowledge it. The moment when they read those reports documenting 5th Panzer Army's destruction was the moment they knew Germany would lose the war in the West, not because they lacked will or determination, but because they had nothing left to fight with that could meaningfully alter the outcome.